Good afternoon, everyone, or at least good afternoon for those of you who are in this time zone. And welcome to the last of a series of talks that the Future of Food programme, part of the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford, have been organising. My name is Charles Godfrey. I'm Director of the Future of Food programme and also of the Martin School itself. One of the fun things about the Future of Food programme is that it brings together people with research interests in food in a very broadest sense from across the university. And the university is divided into 4 divisions: the medical science, the maths, physical and life sciences divisions, the social science divisions, and the humanities divisions. And of the 4 divisions, we have fewest people in the humanities division. And so it is a particular pleasure to welcome John Lidwell-Durnin from the Department of History to speak this afternoon. John is going to be speaking, the title of his talk is "A Human Population Monster: Historical Perspectives on Crop Disease and its Relation to Population." And just to give you a little background on John, John's first degree was from University College Dublin in philosophy, and then he came to Oxford, and he has a DPhil in the history of science from this university. And John's current research is focused on the history of agriculture and botany at the close of the 18th century. So John, many thanks for chatting to us this afternoon, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you especially to Kelly Reid for inviting me to talk in this series. And thanks especially to the Martin School and the Future of Food program. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully that is now live. So I'm sure that the audience will include some people with expertise in agricultural science, perhaps with particular interest in advances made during the Green Revolution. And I definitely have things to learn from those listening, so I'm excited about the question period. My own area of expertise is in late 18th century agriculture and in the scientific institutions of the day. Part of the reason that I'm turning to 20th century figures like Norman Borlaug is because I'm convinced that the deeper past can help us to understand the present day. If Norman Borlaug feels like part of the deeper past as well, that's a little frightening to me, but at least I hope to point out that a lot of us continue to think about food and population just the way that Norman Borlaug did until his death in 2009. We might not use Borlaug's phrase, "the human population monster," today, but we know what those words mean. And while we might not be convinced that such a monster exists, a lot of us still fear it. One of the things that I want to show today is that while the rhetorical aspects of our debates around overpopulation change in order to suit the values of the time, anxieties concerning overpopulation stretch back into the distant past. Like a lot of historians, I feel that the period I work on and study is special. And while fears of overpopulation and food security stretch back far beyond the 18th or 17th century, when the economists and the agriculturalists that I study are writing, I feel it's during the late 1700s in particular that a lot of the ways that we think about agriculture, about the threat of crop disease and population, crystallize into the shapes that they continue to have today. So without further ado, I just wanted to include what I think is probably Borlaug's favorite picture of himself, or ought to be his favorite picture of himself. This is from his days wrestling. So I want to begin just by thinking a bit about Borlaug's relationship to the ideas of Malthus. Borlaug himself, when receiving the Nobel Prize for his work in developing the Green Revolution wheats that have been credited with averting famine in Asia, he wrestled with the legacy of the economist and Anglican minister Thomas Robert Malthus. On December 11th, 1970, after a year when he'd faced a surprising amount of criticism from people like Paul Ehrlich and William Paddock, Borlaug felt pressured to explain in his prize speech where he did and did not agree with the 18th century writer. And it's worth, I think, quoting. He writes, "Malthus signaled the danger of overpopulation a century and a half ago. But he emphasized principally the danger that population would increase faster than food supplies. In his time, he could not foresee the tremendous increase in man's food production potential. I am optimistic for the future of mankind, for in all biological populations, there are innate devices to adjust population growth to the carrying capacity of the environment. So in that speech, Borlaug was very clear on where he did and where he did not agree with Malthus. Now, during the 1970s, Borlaug grew increasingly pessimistic, introducing into his talks and papers a phrase, the human population monster, which was clearly a reworking of Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb. I think Borlaug's choice of the word monster very honestly reflects how Malthus haunted him, just as Malthus haunted Ehrlich, Paddock, and many others that worked to raise alarm over the threat of overpopulation in the 1970s. Now, I don't have anything in this talk to say about whether or not there is a human population monster, and I hope that won't disappoint anyone. What historians can tell us on this area is the material history of how we ourselves have been frightened by the population monster in the past, how this monster first entered our minds in modern European history, and how we have argued about its existence or its non-existence, and why we sometimes insist that it is real, even when it doesn't seem to be threatening us immediately. Okay. So without any further disclaimers, let me quickly walk through the structure of the talk. I'm going to begin the talk by looking at pre-Malthusians and the emergence of some ideas about population and crop losses in 17th century Britain. And before that, I'm going to then, after that, I'm going to fast forward to harvest crises that occur at the close of the 18th century during the time that Malthus is writing. Malthus is one of the most studied figures in intellectual history, so I'm not going to say that much about Malthus himself. I'm going to limit my discussion of Malthus to his remarks on crop failures, because I want to point to people working and thinking around him. I'm also going to pass over the Great Irish Famine of 1845, 1849, but for those interested, there is a wealth of fantastic writings on how the appearance of potato blight led to Malthusian accusations that the famine in Ireland could be blamed on overpopulation. Cormac O'Grada is a fantastic historian for that theme. Anyway, in the next part of the talk, I'll focus on the impact of crop diseases during Norman Borlaug's career and analyze some of the motivations he had for shifting his focus to the danger of overpopulation after he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1970. Okay. So I want to begin with a curious early modern quote from Cressy Dymock, who warns that there are as many such pairs of pigeons as there is men, women, and children in England. I've preserved his grammar. So I want to begin by looking at how agriculturalists concerned with political arithmetic in the 17th century responded to some harvest crises that coincided with the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I. And I've stolen some data to give you a sense of what is happening on if you're data inclined. So political upheaval and war were certainly contributing factors to the food shortages the historians have documented in this period. But we also know from witness accounts that bad weather contributed to the series of harvest crises. Regional shortages, high food prices, both contributed to extreme dearth. And there's a lot of historical debate over how many people starved to death in England during this period. General consensus is that it didn't constitute famine, but that certainly there were people dying of hunger in badly affected areas. What's important for our purposes is that many of those writing on political, agricultural, and economic questions in Britain during this time seem to have believed that Britain was overpopulated, or more accurately, they believed that agricultural production was so poor that it wasn't self-sufficient. So-called political arithmetic or economics was only just coming into use in Britain, and there wasn't much data available at the time on yields or food production, imports or exports, or even the population of the island. A lot of guesswork and inference went into trying to calculate population and food production, and also things like pigeon population. So on this next part of the talk, I want to draw on some of the papers that belong to someone named Samuel Hartlib. He was a so-called intelligencer who ran an international correspondence network in the 1640s and 1650s. Samuel Hartlib certainly hoped that Britain's population would increase, but he was deeply concerned that unless agricultural methods improved, depopulation and hunger would be the result. Now, you'll notice some strange figures about pigeons have appeared on the screen. Samuel Hartlib's surviving papers provide a fantastic source for historians because Hartlib communicated on all sorts of topics, mathematics, philology, alchemy, mechanics, natural history, and his surviving papers include a lot of material that he would use and kind of develop into pamphlets and publish at the time. Included in this is a pamphlet on the destruction of corn. We don't know who wrote this memo, but the memo provides a really early glimpse into how crop losses and overpopulation were thought about. So as you can see, this memo concerns pigeons. And if we look through it, what the author in this memo is trying to do is trying to tabulate how many pigeons there are in Cambridge and what kind of damage they're causing. I can't vouch for the mathematics here, but I think the numbers are interesting in terms of how people are trying to calculate and realize these problems mathematically. So the author of this memo suggests that there are 163 parishes in Cambridge, 3 dove houses per parish, about 200 nests per dove house, leading to a population maybe around 98,000 pigeons. Then the author of this memo gives us some estimates about how many pints of seed your average pigeon is probably consuming during planting weeks. And the author kind of continues with these guesstimates and figures that the damage done by pigeons that are kept by landowners, kept by farmers. If you missed that point, keeping dove houses and keeping pigeons was a common practice in Britain for a variety of purposes. So pigeon houses were common. So he estimates that the cost to the kingdom, if Cambridge is normal, would be about £1.7 million. The very interesting thing about this pamphlet is that the author begins to discuss how to think about this damage in terms of what it would have fed to the poor. So there's this quote that it's neither fitting nor lawful for any man to have a dove house when so many poor people and their families may be. So the author of the memo estimates that the corn lost to pigeons could have fed Britain's poorest families for 9 weeks. And in so doing, the author of the memo calculated the losses to pigeons in terms of food that would have been available to the poor. So wealthy owners had not optimized their cultivation practices and land management to feed the population. By keeping pigeons, one could quantify the food lost that would otherwise feed the poor. That's a remarkable and interesting document, which greatly influenced Samuel Hartlib. So in Samuel Hartlib's writings, diseases like mildew, blight, smuttiness in corn, all of these were viewed as potentially aspects of cultivation that could be overcome. Pests, whether they were pigeons or fungi, were viewed by Samuel Hartlib as preventable. As Hartlib wrote in one agricultural pamphlet around this time, if the poor dedicated themselves to perfecting the arts of agriculture, and to quote, if God bless the labors of all these, we are never like to see a famine. So Hartlib was an optimist. Hartlib believed in a good future. In his treatises, Hartlib made it clear what perfecting the agricultural arts entailed. Choosing seed acclimatized to one's region, sowing seed according to methods that would mitigate against disease. And he also gives us a list, which I think is very revealing, of the factors that he believed caused smut or rust in wheat. He was a bit unclear about whether or not he was talking about smut or rust in places. Anyway, let's look at the causes he lists. Number 1, he thinks a moist season around kerning time. Number 2, he thinks growing wheat on low moist ground. Number 3, he blames dunged land, kind of over manuring. Number 4, sowing seed from infected wheat. Number 5, sowing seed from unexhausted fields. Number 6 is scratched out, Mars and Saturn. He toyed with the idea that astrology might be to blame, that the influence of the stars could be causing crop diseases, but he decided no, that's not it. What I want to draw out from that is that causes 3, 4, and 5 are all direct consequences of cultivation practices. Arguably, number 2 is as well. So Hartlib thought that environmental factors were part of the problem, but that the majority of crop diseases affecting wheat in Britain could be prevented by shifting practice. So if you think back to the pigeon memo that we were looking at, that was looking at crop losses in terms of losses that were a direct result of the cultivation practice of keeping dove houses, of keeping pigeons. Eliminate that and more food is brought out. Hartle, again, is looking at disease in the same way, and he's saying, if we change cultivation practices, we can mitigate against disease and there will be more food for all. So this is basically they're creating the base of literature that is going to become not gospel, but certainly the foundational text for thinking about agricultural science in the late 18th century. Okay. Let's jump now to harvest crises in the 1790s. Famine is a very real part of life in the 18th century. 1740 to 41 sees famines in Ireland and France that leave upwards of 1 million dead. The Bengal famine of 1770 may have killed around 7 million people. So the intervening period has plenty of famines, plenty of food upsets that we can look at. I'm skipping here to focus in on the context of Malthus. When these harvest crises hit Britain in the 1790s, just at the moment where it is engaged with war in France and fears of revolution, a lot of agriculturalists focused in on the question of crop diseases. Now, that's not to say that the harvest crises of the 1790s were caused primarily by crop diseases. In fact, I'm sure they weren't. Bad weather, problems in transport caused by war, public fears of rising food prices, possibly even hoarding of grain to raise prices. A lot of factors go into causing a harvest crisis. But for the agriculturists that were living through it, it was generally agreed that weather in Britain was never so bad that it risked starving the population. That was almost entirely agreed upon by all agriculturalists that wrote in this period. Weather was manageable, and at any rate, weather was beyond control. The disease was another factor. Crop diseases gained so much attention in this period, not because they drove shortages, but because they were viewed as unnecessary and as driven by human cultivation practices. Potato leaf roll virus, or curl, was almost universally blamed on the potato cultivation methods employed by farmers with infected crops. Farmers that suffered blight or mildew in their wheat crops usually blamed seed quality or the unsuitableness of the variety to the damp or wet conditions in which they were farming. As harvests failed due to bad weather in 1793, the Prime Minister William Pitt was persuaded by John Sinclair and some others to found a Board of Agriculture. And he charged it with first trying to compile some data on agricultural production, but also to identify the best cultivation practices and to diffuse these to practicing farmers. So the Board of Agriculture was in some ways a slightly better funded version of Samuel Hartlib's Correspondence Network. Most of the members of the board had certainly read Hartlib. 120 years later, and a lot of the advice and ideas put forward in that book were still regarded as scientific or at least wise. And not unlike Hartlib, the members of the board also regarded crop disease as preventable largely preventable through the adoption of rational cultivation practices. Basically, a well-managed farm in Britain ought to be able to avoid large losses to mildew, to blight, and to potato curl. So the board attracted dozens of agricultural writers and amateurs interested in communicating practices and ideas. And it was out of this data that its secretary, Arthur Young, worked to compile treatises on scientific methods. This is Arthur Young. He'd climbed to a position of prominence in British science through his writings on agricultural science. And he had a lot of influence and authority during the time that Malthus is writing. So Malthus is certainly the big name for this period. But if you're trying to think of someone who really has the ear of the government, that's Arthur Young in his position as secretary of this board. And I think it's important of getting a handle on basically what Arthur Young believes about population and agricultural production, because his views are extremely dissimilar to those of Malthus. So in the 1790s, Young largely upholds across his writings that populations decline if agriculture is neglected. He's quite strong on that. He believes that rural populations will increase only if there is demand for agricultural labor. He believes that crop losses to disease are usually caused by poor cultivation. And he thinks that poor cultivation is symptomatic of decline in agriculture, which betokens population decline anyway. So Young was also of the opinion that nature was stable and that nothing in climate or the spread of disease was going to go that wrong in Britain. And that's quite important. Young felt that there was over a century of documented agricultural history between himself and Samuel Hartlib, and Young saw no sense in which population would suddenly explode or crop diseases would suddenly emerge to destroy the countryside. Here I will say something briefly about Malthus. For those not familiar, Malthus publishes an essay during this period titled An Essay on Population, where he advanced his famous theory that populations expand exponentially and agricultural production only arithmetically, meaning that it's a natural or an economic law that populations continue to grow until they outstrip their means of food production. Malthus didn't write extensively on crop disease. He was tremendously interested in agriculture. And he was also interested in the ideas of Arthur Young, who, as I said, had a lot more influence. So Young was largely in support of increased potato cultivation. He thought the diseases that affected potatoes could be reduced through improved cultivation. Malthus's response is interesting, and it's worth reading it out. Mr. Young has intimated that if people were fed upon milk and potatoes, they would be more independent of scarcities than at present. But why this should be the case, I really cannot comprehend. Undoubtedly, people who live upon potatoes will not be much affected by a scarcity of wheat. But is there any contradiction in the supposition of a failure in the crops of potatoes? I believe it is generally understood that they are more liable to suffer damage during the winter than grain. The failures in the 1790s were so pervasive that a lot of people at that time had begun to question whether or not potatoes should be encouraged as a wide replacement of wheat. The economist Adam Smith was a great proponent of potatoes, and the historian Rebecca Earle at Warwick has actually recently published a book called Feeding the People, which charts dozens of other advocates of potato cultivation right at this time. Through the 1800s, a lot of the enthusiasm was the recognition that potatoes produced more food per acre than wheat. And given the tremendous damage that crop diseases had caused in the 1790s to wheat, a lot of the agriculturalists attached to the Board of Agriculture felt it was wise to increase potato cultivation so as not to be so exposed in the future to failures in wheat. But this led to strong criticisms from a number of people with ties to either the Board of Agriculture or indeed the Horticultural Society. So let's look at Scottish economist John Ramsay MacCulloch. John Ramsay MacCulloch was editing the writings of Adam Smith at this time, and he actually included an appendix into his edition of Adam Smith just to criticize Adam Smith on potatoes. MacCulloch thought that potatoes were a disaster, not just because of their susceptibility to disease, but because he viewed that if you increased the cultivation of potatoes, that meant that more people could survive. Basically, the population would increase to eat them. And once that population has increased, you cannot go back to wheat cultivation. You are locked into dependency on potatoes. And any disaster that strikes the potato crop will result in disaster. He wasn't the only person thinking along these lines. Joseph Sabine was a bit older, but I think it's useful to quote Sabine writing on the same theme. Sabine predicted that the potato, whenever it shall have become the chief or the sole support of a country, must inevitably lead to the misery of famine, more dreadful in proportion to the numbers exposed to its ravages. So there were a lot of debates right in this period over whether or not cultivation of the potato could be relied upon to feed the society. And of course, they're writing just like a decade or 2 decades before the Great Potato Famine. So a lot of what they are speaking to comes to bear very quickly on the country. So hopefully what I've given there is a sense of debate, not just around Malthus's ideas, but around these more technical problems in terms of how populations rely upon crops in the time of Malthus, and the different weights that they put on what you could gain out of a crop such as potatoes against the dangers posed by diseases like curl. Okay. Let's jump ahead now and use the remaining time to talk about Borlaug. So Borlaug in the 1940s takes a job with the Cooperative Wheat Research Program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And he's working to improve agricultural production in Mexico. In 1946, Borlaug begins to develop the shuttle breeding technique, which halves the time it takes researchers to develop new wheat varieties and to test them for resistance to rust. By 1962, Borlaug's breeding station has released its first semi-dwarf wheat variety. He's also, during this time, breeding for resistance to stem rust. So it's these semi-dwarf wheat varieties that Borlaug is breeding in the 1950s and 1960s, which include genes which confer all-stage resistance to stem rust. And these wheats prove incredibly popular in Asia, in the Mediterranean, in South Africa, and they lead to a tremendous success in distributing summit wheats globally. Now, as this slide shows, early 20th century American wheat cultivation was affected by stem rust, and there were nationwide campaigns to eradicate barberry shrubs, which had played a role in the life cycle of stem rust. And a lot of those campaigns prior to Borlaug's work had represented the main hope for combating wheat rust. In 1953, however, there were significant bad losses in America and Western Canada. And they came at a point during the Cold War where there was a lot of emphasis on America being the country that will feed the world. It was very popular, as I'm showing here, to try and run campaigns against barberry. But the appearance of resistant varieties, even in the 1950s, the appearance of wheat varieties that would be resistant to rust didn't console everyone. And it might be worth having a quick quote here from Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, who represented growing political concern that America's farmers would not be able to feed the world. To quote from a section that he felt was very telling, when we place the current problems we face in the context of a thus far uncontrollable plant disease, 15B rust, there is some considerable likelihood that these so-called burdensome surpluses of food and fiber may, as has happened several times in the recent past, turn out to be amongst our greatest blessings. By 1968, the semi-dwarf rust-resistant wheat varieties developed by Borlaug in Mexico were being taken up for cultivation in Asia. Mexico had gone from relying upon imports to becoming an exporter of wheat, and the appearance of works like Famine 1975 by Will Paddock and the population bomb that were predicting global Malthusian disasters, these were beginning to look like they had overlooked the powers of science. Borlaug was set to deliver his Nobel speech on December 11th, but as his archives show, 1970 was an eventful year and one that features some angry correspondence, and including also a epidemic. So 1970 witnessed corn leaf blight hit American crops. It caused catastrophic failures, and newspapers and science magazines were quick to communicate a picture that the blight had been the worst in history, precisely because the corn cultivated was genetically homogeneous. Pictured here are some reports about it in the news. Now, some of the reporters, to Borlaug's deep annoyance, claimed that the corn grown in America had been bred to include genes resistant to the leaf blight, and that these had failed. What you're looking at right here, Borlaug was a very angry reader, and his archives have preserved all his marginalia. So these are Borlaug's angry notes on a story titled Green Revolution Courts Disaster, which was published in August 1970. I don't know if you can read the phrases here, but he's written fools, he's written not true, who doesn't. Basically, what this page had been doing was arguing that the Green Revolution was no answer to the population concerns that were raised by people like Paddock and Ehrlich. A month later, Borlaug takes to his typewriter and he writes a very angry letter to William Paddock, where he says, "I resent bitterly being called one of those clowns who are talking of feeding a big population in the year 2000 for make-believe green revolutions." And he continues, "We have generated hope where there was despair. We have brought maybe 20 to 30 years of time for others to come to grips with all the multiple aspects of the population problem." So it's from 1970 to 1974 that Borlaug, on the basis of these criticisms that occur around the same time as he's being awarded the Nobel Prize, around the same time as this instance of cornleaf blight, Borlaug is working to clarify his position. And if Ehrlich called population a bomb, Borlaug wasn't about to be outdone. So as I'm showing here, 1974, he gives a talk called "Can We Stave Off World Disaster by Feeding the Hungry Until We Can Tame the Population Monster?" His position has gained a question mark, and it's also the first time where Borlaug uses the phrase monster in relation to the human population. Despite the fact that 1975 comes and goes and that Ehrlich's views are increasingly outdated, Borlaug doubles down and in 1977 delivers his paper, "The Human Population Monster." And I want to use the remaining time just to highlight some of the key features where Borlaug finds himself holding by the 1977-78 paper. So the main arguments in this paper are that we need to refocus the conservation movement. We need to abandon piecemeal campaigns and recognize overpopulation as the root cause for all environmental degradation. He views the food population ratio as worsening drastically, and he views crop diseases as becoming increasing risks as that happens. He believes still that food production can double between 1975 and 2015, but that these are all temporary measures which are just buying us time. He viewed this paper as incredibly important, and one of the things I have been doing is going through his correspondence and getting a sense of everyone to whom he seems to have sent this paper. And as you can see from this slide, he sends it everywhere. It goes to the US State Department, it goes to embassies in India, it goes to population movements, it goes to the Rockefeller Foundation. So Borlaug very strongly commits to these positions in the wake of the criticisms that he suffers from Ehrlich and from Paddock. Summing up, just a few things to take away. Like Paul Ehrlich, Borlaug's position on overpopulation, it was plastic, and it was responsive to changes in modeling and also to ethical questions raised by some of the heavy-handed movements that emerged in the 1970s. So by his death in 2009, Borlaug remains active in campaigns to eliminate wheat rust. He's certainly still worried about the threat posed to food security by population growth. But as I stress, along with everyone else, he's constantly updating and shifting his positions. He doesn't stick with human population monster that much longer. Since 1970, we increasingly view crop diseases like corn blight and wheat rust as problems that arise from our own cultivation practices. By extending cultivation of crops with all-stage resistance, for example, like in the case of the SR31 gene in wheat, we increase the probability that a variety of stem rust would evolve virulence. And that happened indeed in 1998 in Uganda with the emergence of stem rust variety UG99. We're continually working to breed new varieties that are resistant to disease, but at the same time, we view the threat posed by disease as a consequence of how we farm. Pictured here is the Swedish physician Hans Rosling, who climbed to internet fame with his talks on how population will peak and then decline in the 22nd century. And he, I think, has very much represented a strong criticism, or at least a challenge to the popularity of Malthusian ideas. Oxford has a philosopher, Toby Ord, who has published papers on population and human flourishing, where he's posed the question as to whether or not there are any justifiable reasons for claiming that we know there is an optimal number of people, or that that number is below 8 billion. No one disputes the influence that Malthus has had on our own time, but we don't always appreciate that it isn't Malthus alone that influenced Borlaug or ourselves. These ways of thinking about agricultural production, about population, and risk posed by crop losses to disease, they took a lot of work to produce. Debates over pigeon populations in Cambridge, investigations into the preservation of potatoes, efforts to weigh the risks posed by wheat disease and potato disease. There was a lot of work and argumentation that went into fashioning these ideas that are often presented as self-evident or even inescapable by people, including today. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Indeed, John. If ever an argument was needed in that we can think more clearly about the present by thinking about what's happened in history, then I think you've made it really strongly there. So that I found that absolutely fascinating. I've got a couple of questions for you, and something I should have said right at the beginning to the people listening in is you should see, these are the people listening in live, of course, you should see down the bottom right-hand corner of your screen an Ask a Question button, and please do ask a question, and I'll come on to them in a second. And there's also the capacity to vote on questions there. So if you see a question that you are particularly interested in me asking John, then please vote on it. John, I was particularly struck by a quote that you gave of Norman Borlaug. In all biological populations, there are innate devices to adjust population growth to the carrying capacity of the environment. And I have a background in evolutionary biology, and it struck me that that was very much influenced by the sort of consensus among population ecologists and evolutionary biologists in the middle of the 20th century that natural selection operated at the level of the species, that the species had a means of adapting so that it did not exploit its resources. And this was in opposition to Malthus and then to Darwin. And Darwin, again, as you know, is hugely influenced by Malthus. And that idea sort of begun to be questioned in the late 60s, early 70s. The single person I think one would associate it was Bill Hamilton, Imperial College, then Michigan, and then Oxford, and other people such as John Maynard Smith, George Williams in the States. So my question was there intellectual interplay between those different fields, between evolutionary biology and population biology? Ehrlich certainly would have been very well aware of these discussions. And when did that view that Borlaug was articulating really take hold within the agricultural world?
Good, thank you so much. That's a fantastic question. I don't know how far I can go to answering it. The wider views in the kind of post-war era are a bit beyond, but certainly looking further back, one of the most pervasive questions in evolutionary thought and applying to human societies was the question of whether or not the laws of natural selection, as they're discovered by evolutionary biologists, do they or don't they apply to the human species? Have the human species evolved intellectual capacities, which means that laws that we find applying to the animal kingdom, do they or don't they still apply? And that's a point of extreme debate and tension through the late 19th and early 20th century. I also am very interested in that cue in Borlaug's talk, but I don't see him investigate it much further in later literature. So I'm not sure. I think it was something that Borlaug believed, but I don't see too many points in my own research where it is explored or where it's evaluated. But I'm only so far in the project, so that might exist beyond what I've looked at so far.
And I do find it interesting that although within studies of wild plants and animals, and the view of this innate capacity to stop resource exploitation has largely gone out, then within the human species, because of the demographic transition, which we observe as an empirical fact, but we don't completely understand how it happens, then this really does underlie Borlaug's philosophy that you were quoting him in the 70s, that what he was doing was giving the world 20 or 30 years in order for these other things to happen.
Yes.
The second question I was going to ask was actually a question that has been given on the website as well, and this is around diversification of crops. So, was diversification of crops ever talked about in the 18th or 19th century as a strategy against crop loss, or was it always a case of focusing on only a few key crops? And I guess there are two elements to that. One is the diversification about having multiple crops, so that you had some resilience if you had one disease. And then I wondered if you're aware when it first became apparent that there was gain to be had by diversifying within a crop, so to have multiple strains of wheat in the hope that not all will be susceptible to the same pathogen.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to kind of answer it piecemeal, just drawing a few examples, if that's all right. First of all, 18th century, early 19th century agriculture, it's widespread practice that you trade, if you're growing cereals, it's widespread practice that you trade seed with neighboring towns, with neighboring areas. And that's strongly encouraged. So one of the main practices that is adopted and probably stretches back through time is the importance of trading seed. There's a lot of historiographical debate about how good people were at identifying and keeping varieties pure, so that certainly when we look back in the historical record, people are, even in the 1700s, people are pointing out, say, a variety of potatoes or a variety of wheat as being particularly prone to disease. They give it a name, but it's difficult for us to assess how, to what extent farmers knew, okay, this wheat that I'm cultivating, it's the wheat that I just read about in the pamphlet. That seems kind of hard to tabulate. In terms of the proliferation of varieties, one of the people that I had to skip over was a horticulturalist named Thomas Andrew Knight, who was in Hertfordshire. And Thomas Andrew Knight was deeply motivated towards encouraging wealthy landowners and farmers to set aside land to try and cultivate and breed new varieties. Knight was particularly persuaded that a lot of the disease affecting crops was because the varieties that people were cultivating in Britain were old. He thought that old varieties were more susceptible to disease than freshly bred new varieties. And so he said, you have a patriotic duty, if you have land and if you have money, to try and breed new varieties. I think Knight himself produced about 25 or 30 varieties of potato in his lifetime. And he would send seed to other farmers. So he was a tremendous proponent of the idea that diversification and the breeding of new varieties is important. And that was around the he's doing that work from about 1795 through 1830s.
That's fascinating. And in fact, there was another question from Kevin Donkers, which was saying very much the same thing, asking about the context of diversity. Avril Aslet Bentley asked a question which, well, let me ask you first. Now, I might also comment on it. Is it feasible that we could encounter a generic global crop pandemic for an important staple like wheat in a way that could be similar to COVID? Clearly something that's on our mind at the moment. Let me go to you first, John, because you mentioned UG99 as well.
Yeah. Look, I'm only answering as a historian, so I certainly want to defer to others on this question. From my perspective, it's definitely true that the 20th century, as all-stage resistance genes were bred into, say, the Green Revolution era wheats, Norman Borlaug was perfectly aware of the risk of evolutionary mechanisms that If you take a gene like SR31, which confers all stage resistance to stem rust, and if that becomes increasingly popular and it's cultivated globally, if stem rust develops virulence against that gene, then all the wheat that's being grown everywhere is, as the question suggests, prone to infection. So, I mean, the science is constantly changing, and I'm not in a good position to say how breeding has caught up with that. But I think certainly for Borlaug and certainly for other figures in the 20th century, that's a problem of time scale. So if you stop breeding for resistance, or if you don't stack your genes for pyramid resistance to play a probability game, that catches up with you. Borlaug was annoyed because he felt that people didn't always appreciate that when he produced wheat rust resistant strains, that wasn't forever. And Borlaug felt that there wasn't enough public appreciation that the varieties that he bred resistance into, that those were as temporary as other measures. Charles, you might have something to add to that.
Well, a brief thing to add is yes, I think Avril is right that there still is a risk, and certainly there's a lot of worry about the UG99, the pathogen there, which so far hasn't been quite as bad as people feared it might be. I think the good news is that we have the capacity today to breed new varieties very fast, sort of the equivalent of what we've seen with the response to vaccination in the COVID world. I think a question for society is whether we want to use modern technologies such as genetic manipulation, which isn't the only way to breed resistant varieties, but does make it much faster. So I think there's some interesting questions there. Let me move on to a really interesting question by Helen Brewood. Can you talk about viewpoints and populations from female thinkers or feminists from this period? Were there any female thinkers who were active in these debates?
Yes, yeah, very much so. In fact, one of the only real reasons I think that Malthus gains the fame that is attributed to him in the 19th century is because of the Unitarian feminist author Harriet Martineau. So Harriet Martineau is writing the Illustrations of Political Economy, and she's also very important because, firstly, Martineau's writings, they're tremendously influential. Everyone reads them. In fact, I think that Charles Darwin reads Harriet Martineau before he reads Malthus, because Charles Darwin's sister sends him a copy of Illustrations of Political Economy to take on the Beagle. And then he meets Harriet Martineau when he returns in 1837 or 1838. But there's no evidence that he's read Malthus before he's read Martineau. So I like to think that Darwin is responding more to Martineau than he is to Malthus. There's a lot of fantastic scholarship on how Martineau's views on population differed from those of Malthus. I wouldn't do them justice right now, but there's a tremendous literature on Martineau. I would point to her.
What we might get you to do, John, if you don't mind, is to give us some further reading for those of us who would like to follow up on some of the things that you've done, and then we'll put it on the website.
That would be fantastic.
I was really interested in you were talking about the Pitt the Younger, wasn't it? You said set up the Board of Agriculture that was the 1790s, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, around 1793.
So the question I had was, how did agricultural research, over what time period, did it shift for being a sort of aristocratic amateurs and sort of enthusiasts? And of course, there was Farmer George, George III, who was enthusiastic. How did that shift to become sort of more institutionalized and state funded?
It's a really good question, and one of the strange. I mean, the caveat that about state funding is difficult because even though Pitt establishes the Board of Agriculture at the moment where there are food shortages, there are food riots, he's fearful of revolution, it's still a voluntary organization. it doesn't quite get the adequate state funding it needs to do what it's supposed to do. So it relies on donations. There's a very interesting epistemological question about how you assemble an agricultural science in this period, because there were no experimental farms. So one of the first things that Arthur Young, William Marshall, and others began saying is, please, can we have the money for an experimental farm so we can put some of these ideas that we have into practice? They don't get it. So there's occasional talk of purchasing 20, maybe 30 acres to allow some of these experiments, but it's basically left for wealthy landowners to practice as they will. The epistemological question is about who has the knowledge. And if you look to how agricultural science is being formed in this period, it's drawing almost exclusively on peasant expertise, a historical term basically for its observation of how farms are being run across Britain, across France, across Ireland. And it's the culmination of kind of anecdotal evidence of cultivation practices that comes to constitute the body of what gets called agricultural science in this period. The big problem that people like Arthur Young have or William Marshall have is, how do you sort from that? How do you sort from that the practices that constitute rational or constitute effective cultivation practices, and those that, for lack of a better word, are ignorant or counterproductive? They had no real way of gauging that, particularly because in traveling and gathering cultivation practices, they also were completely uncertain as to what practices would suit one region but work counterproductively in another. So they weren't always clear on to what extent soil types determined whether or not a particular practice in using dung or marl was suitable or unsuitable. Elevation represented other problems. So they had no real framework for solving a lot of the epistemological problems they had when they were trying to develop this science. So I'm sure for agricultural scientists looking back, it's a frustrating and deeply convoluted period in which they're working. Probably a short answer to the question. Peter Jones and other historians tend to focus on soil chemistry as being a clear moment. So the work of Humphrey Davy, the work of Liebig in identifying the inorganic agents in soil. But it's hard. It's hard to see. It's hard to know what you're looking for in trying to.
Experimental farms didn't come in until when? The middle of the 19th century?
Oh, that's a good question, which I should know. The first proper experimental farm is 19th century, but I can't remember the date where it's established.
So I was fascinated by your point about the epistemology there, and to what degree were the academies such as the Royal Society, some of the other regional academies, and I guess going back into the 18th century, the Lunar Club and things like that, to what extent were they interested in agriculture, or were they sort of, I guess, the Lunar Club more industrial and the Royal Society more what we might call today basic research?
Well, I mean, it's Joseph Banks who's provided, Joseph Banks being president of the Royal Society in this period, it's Joseph Banks who contacts Thomas Andrew Knight in the 1790s and says, I'd like to start a horticultural society. Would you possibly be interested in joining the society that I want to join? So I think what Banks is trying to do is trying to diversify the institution and to develop specialized institutions that would take to task some of the different aspects of the discipline. But I mean, the RSA, the various institutes that have a focus on industry or commerce, if you go through the period.
Society of Agriculture. Sorry, just to interrupt you, the RSA, that's the Royal Society of Agriculture.
Yeah, sorry. And it's the abbreviation has gone out of my head all of a sudden. The society founded in 1754 for the promotion of the mechanical arts. The society, it's gone. I'm
I
terribly
thought
sorry. A symptom of COVID. Anyway, the very important society founded in 1754 to promote the mechanical arts and manufacturing and science in the country, which provides a few premiums. And I would say very much that, at least in Britain, the societies that are taking an interest in agriculture very often rely on prizes or the awarding of premiums for questions. So they say, okay, what's an important question in agriculture? Maybe it's what are the causes of smut in wheat? And they say, we'll set a premium on it, and we'll ask any gentleman to write in and to punt for the prize and see if we get something valuable.
It was fascinating, the graph you showed of wheat prices at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and with what sort of deceptively, I'm sure, looks like a cycle sort of going on. And you were talking about weather, and you were talking about crop diseases, but you didn't talk about the huge debates that were going on at that time about trade and other economic interventions that would have affected. Clearly, you only had limited time, but how important was the sort of political economy in affecting the price?
In terms of, as an historian, out of humility, I try to separate the actual causal factors from the crisis versus the smaller slice of the pie that I work on, which is how the crisis encouraged debate and discussion of crop diseases and their role in causing the crisis. So I'm very focused on the chatter in kind of agricultural circles around the crisis and around how to better manage farms. That's the slice of these that I hone in on. The wider questions as to how these food shortages and how these crises come about, I think I defer to the long-standing debates between Cormac O'Grada and Amartya Sen over artificial famines, the roles of trade and transport networks, and ecological and climate impacts. There's such a wealth of literature, and particularly for economic history in Britain, it's such a classic problem for economic history. I wouldn't do it justice weighing in. But there are whole disciplines that are founded on posing questions as to what are the proximate causes of these problems.
John, I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our allotted time here. Let me first thank the people who have asked questions. And I think I've been able to get to everyone who asked questions. And let me finish by thanking you again. Certainly for someone like me, who's a natural scientist working on problems today, it's very easy to forget that what we're doing today is just the end of a long process, and many of the things that we think about today can be clarified, and new insights can be got by thinking about either cognate or, in some cases, the very same arguments that have been had over time. And thank you for describing some of these issues in such clear and fascinating terms. Thanks very much, John.
Thank you, everyone.